Hi, my name's Caleb from ithinkbiblically.com, and in this video I want to address a specific claim that Muslims make, and that is the claim that Muhammad is mentioned by name in the Bible, specifically the book Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 16. But let's begin by reading the passage and then we can start discussing it. Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 16. His mouth is sweetness itself. He is altogether lovely. This is my beloved. This is my friend, daughters of Jerusalem. Now, Muslims insist that the word translated altogether lovely in the Hebrew is pronounced Muhammadim. And so therefore they claim that Muhammad is mentioned by name in the Bible.
Now, the phrase which says he's altogether lovely actually is a word which in Hebrew is sounded Muhammadim.
Now, I'm going to look at this word specifically in a moment, but first I want to look at the broader context of the book Song of Solomon. Then I want to look at the immediate context, chapter 5. Then I want to begin discussing the specifics of the pronunciation of this word and its meaning. So let's first look at the context. If you've ever read the book Song of Solomon, you will realize that it is actually a love song, and it describes the relationship between King Solomon and his wife. And throughout the song, it discusses the early stages of their relationship through to their courting period, their marriage, and the wedding night. This is what the book Song of Solomon is about. Now, if you read the book carefully, you will realize that when the individual woman is described, oftentimes the description is actually a description of the land of Israel. And you'll also notice, if you look very carefully, that the man is sometimes described in terms of the specifics of the temple. The smell of cedar and the decorations and so forth that are in the temple are used as descriptive terms to describe the man. The man specifically in chapter 5 verse 16 that is said to be altogether lovely. And so therefore some scholars argue that this is actually not only a song about Solomon and his bride, but it is also a song about God and the nation of Israel. Now, some Christian scholars go further and say that because Jesus is God, it is also a description of Jesus and his church. Now, those are all valid, I think, perspectives. I think we can definitely say it's of King Solomon and his wife, and we can definitely say that some aspects of it are descriptive of God's relationship with Israel, and it's very possible that it is also something that can be applied to Jesus and his church from the Christian perspective. But whatever the case, we know absolutely that the overall context of the book has nothing to do with Muhammad. Absolutely nothing to do with Muhammad. And Muslims need to accept this right at the beginning, that the overall context has nothing to do with Muhammad. But Muslims argue that the book is corrupt, and it is only these specific little bits that are true, the parts that refer to Muhammad. That brings us to the immediate context of chapter 5. Now, by the time we get to chapter 5, the story has progressed to the point where King Solomon is now married to his bride, and he is on his wedding night, and he is about to go and sleep with his wife on his wedding night. Now, what's interesting is that in verse 1 it tells us very clearly that he was drinking wine and that he was encouraging his guests, that is the guests of the wedding, to drink wine as well, while he goes off to the bride. It was a segregated marriage here at this point. And so if we read it very carefully, we can see the immediate context is the wedding night of King Solomon. Now let me read to you some of the verses to prove that to you. My beloved thrust his hand through the latch opening. My heart began to pound for him. I arose to open for my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with flowing myrrh on the handles of the bolt. I opened for my beloved. So we can see very clearly here that this is the wedding night of King Solomon with his bride. And when we get to verse 10, we're getting very close to verse 16 here. When we get to verse 10, we see that the song begins to break out in the bride's description of King Solomon on the night. Verse 10 describes his radiant appearance. Verse 11 describes his head and his hair. Verse 12 describes his eyes. Verse 13 describes his cheeks and his lips. Verse 14 describes his arms and his upper body. Verse 15 describes his legs. And then verse 16 describes his mouth, and then concludes by saying he is altogether lovely. And it is here at this point that the Muslims come along and say this word, altogether lovely, is pronounced Muhammadim, and therefore must be talking about Muhammad. Can you see the insanity of this interpretation of the passage? Can you see how stupid and how desperate you actually have to be to claim that this is talking about Muhammad? This is ridiculous.
Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 16. The word Muhammadim is Muhammad, im, I am im.
I know that in English, Muhammadim has been translated to altogether lovely. What I'd like to ask is, why do Christians not know that Muhammad has been spoken about in the Bible?
What about this word translated altogether lovely? Is it really pronounced Muhammadim? Is it really a reference to Muhammad? If you get a good Hebrew dictionary, you will find that it will provide you with the phonics spelling. And phonics spelling is just another way of saying the pronunciation. You will find that the word translated altogether lovely is to be translated Mahmed or Mahmed with the accent, a bit more of a Mahmed in it. And it adds the plural on the end, so it's Mahmedim. Mahmedim.
This is from the Song of Songs, and it says Chiko Mamtakim. It's describing a relationship with God. His palate is sweet, v'kulo machmadim, and his entire presence is one of delight. V'kulo machmadim, and his entire presence is one of delight.
And it is a noun, a descriptive word, not a name, and that's why it is used in the context to describe the overall appearance. The passages describe the various aspects, and then he is altogether lovely, or he is delightful, right? Altogether, an overall description of King Solomon. It has nothing to do with Muhammad. Absolutely nothing. But notice that the Muslims have focused on one word out of the entire book. Not even another word from the chapter is used to try to argue that this is talking about Muhammad. One word which is mispronounced by Muslims. See, the overall context is Solomon and his marriage with his bride. The immediate context is his wedding night, and the word itself is pronounced Mahmadim and has nothing whatsoever to do with Muhammad.